Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our March 2nd edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. As we inch closer toward spring, farmers are busy preparing for the growing season, which means making plans to help maximize yields and environmental responsibility. It also means building on the rapid progress we're making in protecting Iowa's water quality. I recently had a chance to moderate a panel discussion on that water quality progress featuring Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig and Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson. That conversation was part of an evening event for a group of our Farm Bureau leaders, and I wanted to share just a few clips from that discussion here on our podcast, starting with Secretary Naig, who offered a great synopsis of the momentum that we're seeing when it comes to scaling up the practices proven to reduce nitrate runoff through Iowa's collaborative, science-based nutrient reduction strategy.
So when we look in that practice category, there's really two that I'd love to talk about because they are in and of themselves getting to be impressive numbers in what we've got implementation happening. But also the other thing that we want to talk a lot about is, and we're accelerating. Cover crops being probably the first one. Literally you're covering, right, that farm and during the winter months, planting something in the fall, terminating in the spring. And this one literally goes like before the nutrient reduction strategy. 2013 is when we started implementing that. We had about 40,000 acres of cover crops. First year or years of the nutrient reduction strategy, we had about 400,000 acres of cover crops. Today, we have about 4 million acres of cover crops. That's progress. That's scaling up. I get this all the time. You've seen this criticism of the strategy. Well, if we keep implementing at the same pace, it'll take us X number of years, right? Full stop. We're not going to implement at the pace that we're implementing today. That's the point. We're scaling up. That's cover crops. Wetlands would be the second piece. These are nitrate reducing wetlands. Love this practice because, and it factors heavily into the strategy, you can treat several thousand acre watersheds with a few acres of a wetland pool. It's been designed, it's structured, it's got a 150-year design life. You can get up to 90% reduction in the nitrate levels flowing through those wetlands. That progression goes something like we started building those in early 2000. It took us about 20 years to build 100 of those wetlands. In the last 5 years, we've built something like 60 of those. Just last year, 2025, we initiated 26 of those wetlands, right? So you see a progression there. That's what's encouraging to me is that, and we're not satisfied with any of those numbers. What we want to see is a continued progression. So those are maybe a couple of examples that I use when I'm talking about this, but there's a whole range of things that you could point to as saying, these are success stories, these are positives, but we're also needing to feel the urgency to continue to scale up.
President Johnson was quick to point out that these nitrate-reducing practices, like cover crops and wetlands, are just the latest in a series of conservation efforts farmers have been adopting for decades, and will keep advancing as new tools and technology come along.
You know, when I started farming, it became strip till, and now we're into no-till, cover crops, and wetland buffers and saturated buffers and waterways. And all these things are really, really good stories to tell that not only while we're implementing all these things, our production standards are still world-class. It's a tremendous thing to share. And so to be proud of it, to tell the story of progress made with the opportunities, the technology of the day, and where we're headed. A lot of the practices that the Secretary talked about, they were actually born by farmers on farm. These are things that we don't take lightly. I'm excited to the progress that we've made. I'm excited for the progress we're yet to make. This isn't, we've reached this goal line and we're done now. We've never done that. Generations upon generations have always wanted to do better. And that's no different with our story today. We're going to do better tomorrow than we did today, which is better than we did yesterday.
Of course, that doesn't mean we won't run into bumps in the road along the way. Farmers have always had to adapt to Mother Nature, and as Secretary Naig pointed out, that will continue to be the case as we deal with natural factors impacting water quality here in Iowa.
In the metropolitan area here, there's been a lot of conversation again about, we're not just talking about nitrate levels in rivers from last summer. It's the fact that the nitrate removal system has been running again. And so it's causing us to do what you should do, which is say, what's happening? This is different here. It's not unusual for there to be a spike, the one that we know about, that late spring, early summer kind of rise in nitrate levels. But then you think, what's going on? Actually, this is where having Iowa State University and researchers, we can simply pose the question, what's happening? We had kind of a strange fall, didn't we? A little bit warm. December, we had some moisture. We weren't frozen up. I think we're moving some nitrates through the system that way. But also you're talking about, we have projected to be significant naturally occurring nitrate, meaning we're mineralizing the organic matter and we're making organic naturally occurring nitrate here, which is then moving through the system. And so that's that other piece that we have to talk about, which is truth telling. When you think about what's naturally occurring in an acre of Iowa farm ground, by the way, talk about something we kind of skip over. Why do we grow corn and soybeans in the state of Iowa? Why are we one of the most productive places literally on the planet? What is it because of? It is because of our soil. What do we say? It is rich, high organic matter, good dark soil. What is that? What's that mean? Well, it means that we're getting this naturally occurring nutrient, right? And it's really good and it's important when it's in the soil, but it's not so good when it's in the water, right? And you sometimes have to walk people through that. But Iowa State's telling us that we're sitting on a significant amount of that naturally occurring piece, and that it's moving into our streams here, not through tile lines, but actually below tile lines, still moving laterally into our streams. That's a truth that needs to be told and explained in a way that people can, again, understand. But it's also telling us that we've got some nutrients in our soil profile. And so I think we need to be thinking about, well, then what do you do? How do you accommodate for that? Do you know what's going on? Is this a year to adjust your nutrient program because you're looking at what's available in the soil? I mean, I think those are the types of things we ought to be thinking about. So I would just encourage folks to put a sharp pencil to that this year and understand that those are the types of variability that we have to deal with. Again, something that we would like people to understand is that this is a biological system, right, that we're dealing with. It's not linear. It's not the same thing every time. We have to accommodate for that. So I think that's what we're looking at coming into this year is we really need to be thinking about how do we hold those nutrients in place better than we have before? How do you accommodate for that as we head into the growing season?
President Johnson noted that adjusting to changing conditions, using the latest tools and technology, is something farmers do constantly. He even cited a specific example from his own farm that helped illustrate how farmers are using nitrogen much more efficiently than they were able to do in past decades.
I can tell you that this last year on my farm, I had 0.82 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of maize. And if you think about a 25-year farming career, that my operations moved from 1.2 to 0.82. That's a 50% reduction in the per unit raised. That's a good story. Mm-hmm. But it's not just because we didn't know it any better back then. It's because there's tools available today.
According to Secretary Naig, on-farm innovation and constant improvement are a couple of the major reasons why Iowa benefits from a flexible, farmer-led approach to conservation.
This is the wisdom, I think, of how we've structured our approach to doing this in Iowa, which is to say we have a menu of option. And man, if I had $1 for every time somebody comes up and says, all you got to do is X. And, turns out, no. Now, I talked about cover crops and wetlands, right? This is a good example. Hey, cover crops won't work in every operation and are going to work better in some parts of the state than others. Those wetlands, they work on the lobe. They don't work in other parts of the state. That's fine. The places where the wetlands can't be designed, that's the places where we need terraces and waterways and sediment control basins and those types of things, right? The point is, I don't care where you are. I'm going to respect the fact that your farm and your family and your land is different, but I'm also going to tell you that there's something you can do. And there's a role for every single Iowan to play. And I would say that about whether you live in town or whether you are farming and responsible for many acres or whether you got a quarter acre, there's something you can do. But here's the thing. We've proven that it can be done time and time again. So I think we're up to the challenge, but I really want to encourage you to think about those things and feel that urgency to go to the next level.
Secretary Naig was also quick to mention that while farmers play an essential role in protecting water quality, what is critical is a system-wide solution that pairs farmers' efforts with modernized infrastructure by other stakeholders, including cities and utilities, that is built for growth in population, expansion of business, and unpredictable weather.
Hey, by the way, when I'm talking about telling the truth and I'm talking about modernizing how we do things on the farm, we also need to recognize, and this is something that needs to be said in a way that's not defensive, but recognizes that we got to modernize the whole system. Hey, do you know that the metropolitan area here in Des Moines is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the Midwest? Significant population growth. But what does it take when you expand? You need the infrastructure that goes with it. And I think that's another truth. And we can't sound defensive when we say this. It's like, we need to work on modernizing our infrastructure. So do the water treatment plants. So does Des Moines Water Works and Central Iowa Water Works here to accommodate for the growth that we've seen in this capital city area. More residents, data centers, you name it. But that's another truth that we need to talk about, is how do we work together and not point at each other and say, it's all you. It's all your fault. You're the ones that are going to solve this alone. That can't be done. We have to be thinking about this really holistically.
Progress requires partnership. It's also essential for farmers and groups like Farm Bureau to share that progress with consumers. And as President Johnson shared with our Farm Bureau leaders, how we choose to share that story is just as important as the story itself.
Hear what they're saying. Be empathetic about it. I mean, we likely have the same goal to say, yes, I hear what you're saying, and the goal is that we want cleaner water, we want better soil health, whatever it is. Get on that same page with that person and bring them into the conversation. And you might have more in common than what you realize when you've even started it. Because if you bristle from the start, they're going to bristle too. And you're just going to bang away at this one thing that you just can't get an impasse to, when in reality, you've got so much more in common in many, many times. Embrace it and walk alongside them. And once they understand that, we have the same goals, we have the same challenges, we want the same solutions. And here's how we're going to do that together.
When it comes to conservation and farming responsibly, we have a tremendous story to tell. And there's no one better to share that story than the farm families who are experiencing it firsthand. If you'd like to learn more about the progress that's happening as you're sharing that story with the folks in your own life, check out conservationcountsiowa.com. Now let's dive a bit deeper into the topic of water quality. We've already alluded to the ways that natural variables like weather are impacting Iowa's water quality, including an unpredicted nitrate spike this winter. For more on that natural occurrence and how farmers can respond to it this spring, we'll bring on Dr. Mike Castellano and Melissa Miller of Iowa State University and the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. Spokesman editor Tom Block has the story.
Mike and Melissa, you've been traveling around the state this winter talking about the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative and the results of trials conducted last summer. So bring us up to speed on the key messages and what surprised you most about the 2025 nitrogen trial results.
Well, Tom, it was a really wet year and we had a lot of losses in the state. We saw much of that nitrogen show up in our rivers and streams. But what was remarkable about 2025 was that because we had that warm, wet summer, we also had record nitrogen mineralization. So it's often underappreciated just how much nitrogen we have in our soil organic matter. We've talked about this before, Tom, I know you know, but 10,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre on average in the soil organic matter. Every year we can count on microbes to mineralize or transform roughly 100 to 400 pounds or 1 to 4% of that to ammonium and nitrate, the same exact compounds farmers are buying in fertilizer. And last year literally was a record year for the amount of ammonium and nitrate that the microbes produced from our soil organic matter. And we can attribute that high production to that, in some places, record warm and wet summer conditions we had late June into July. That kept that surface soil really warm and wet. That's where most of our organic matter is, and the microbes just went to work transforming it to ammonium and nitrate. And as a result, we saw relatively low optimum fertilizer rates in 2025. So in fact, the lowest of the past 3 years, roughly 185 pounds per acre in 2025 compared to 224 in 2024 and 196 pounds per acre in 2023. We also saw, because of that greater mineralization, higher fertilizer use efficiency despite those losses in 2025.
So nitrate concentrations in some rivers have been running high this winter. How does that soil organic matter contribute to nitrogen leaching and that record nitrogen mineralization?
Well, what we saw last year is we were coming off several consecutive years of relatively low rainfall and drought. And so we likely had some buildup of nitrate and ammonium below the root zone. And so on one hand, that's being pushed out by the extra water. And at the same time, we're seeing that record nitrogen mineralization providing even more nitrogen. And of course, we can't predict ahead of time when we're going to need that 184 pounds of nitrogen per acre on average or the 224. We're trying to do a better job of that through the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative by making measurements on farms and developing predictive models to help forecast that. But that's still a big swing and very tough to predict.
Have we seen these kind of nitrate spikes during the winter in the past? And if so, are there any similarities in the environmental conditions that happened this year that can help us understand why those nitrate levels are so high?
Yeah, we saw similar winter levels in 2015, and it was a very similar several-year weather pattern that we experienced there. A few years of relatively dry conditions, followed by a very wet year.
The nitrogen moves out of the soil in different ways, right? There's a lag. Some of it goes through drainage tile water, but then also just scientifically, there's a variety of ways the nitrogen can move through the soil. It's just not all through drainage tile water.
Well, that's right. There's considerable water movement below the drainage tiles, and that's really what we think is getting activated after these several dry years followed by a wet year. Research from the University of Illinois shows that up to the previous 3 weather years, the management and the weather in those years can help explain the current year's nitrate losses. So there is that legacy effect over time.
So based on the modeling and what you've seen, how might ongoing weather conditions influence soil nitrogen mineralization this spring and summer?
We should be prepared for all conditions. And that emphasizes the role of adaptive management for nitrogen management. We've always got to be considering how things change in the context of our management systems and our weather so we can better manage nitrogen to maximize productivity and profitability and minimize losses to the environment. And so there are a few things we can do in this situation. We can keep an eye on the nitrogen mineralization forecasts that come out weekly from Iowa State University Extension up on the web. Every week during the growing season, beginning really in late March, so before the growing season, our colleague Sotirios Argentoulis puts out essentially it's a weather forecast, but it's a nitrogen mineralization forecast. So it uses the weather and other variables to predict levels of nitrogen mineralization that are occurring all across the state. We can also, just think about how the weather is affecting things. If it's warm and wet, we're generally getting high levels of nitrogen mineralization. If it's drier, we'll have less levels of nitrogen mineralization. We should be prepared for high levels of nitrate losses this year, particularly in the spring when we generally do have higher levels of losses. Given that they're currently high, they're likely going to remain high through the spring, and that emphasizes the importance of using the best management practices we can to avoid any additional nitrogen losses. That would include soil sampling to learn what our residual nitrate levels are in the soil following crop year 2025, and also doing things like side dressing, split applications, nitrification inhibitors, things that we know can contribute to lower losses downstream.
So Melissa, based on what we've learned from these past few years of nitrogen trials, what should farmers be thinking about differently? Maybe soil testing. Soil testing is maybe something traditionally people do in the fall, but this spring that might be a valuable thing for folks to look at least?
The Iowa Nitrogen Initiative samples about 35 trials across the state of Iowa every year in the fall for this residual soil nitrate. And what we saw in 2024, we saw quite a bit more soil nitrate than we did in 2023, but it was pretty variable across the state. And we did see it vary by region. So southern Iowa had almost twice as much residual soil nitrogen than maybe what we would have saw in the Des Moines lobe or some other areas of the state. And because of that, soil sampling, especially in the spring and seeing what's still there right before you plant that crop, really can tell you how you can adjust your nitrogen rate. So if you think of your bank account, if you have money left over at the end of the month before you go to pay next month's bills, then you don't need to add quite as much for income. But if you don't have anything left over, you maybe need to increase your income a little bit. It's the same thing with applying those nitrogen rates. Above all, we suggest including that residual soil nitrogen into your decision making. If you have high amounts in the field, factor that into your considerations. We know that nitrogen decisions are very uncertain. Because of the rain late in the year, you might require more N, but generally, if you have less soil N, your optimum nitrogen rate is going to be higher. And you can use the NFAC tool to really see how that figures into your rate decisions.
Yeah, let's talk about the NFAC tool. You've now collected data from more than 1,000 on-farm trials over the past 3 years, I think. So how can farmers use that tool to take all these data and turn it into a nitrogen rate that actually fits their farm?
Yeah, definitely. So NFACT is really two tools in one, and both of the tools will give farmers the information they need to be more confident in making decisions about the rate. So first, we have the On-Farm Data Explorer. It allows farmers to look at anonymized results from the 1,000 trials that we've conducted with the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative, and they can benchmark against their own system. So today, you can filter results by year, regions, previous crop. Pretty soon, we're going to be updating that feature so you can also sort by application timing and product. And then we'll add information about precipitation to the trials to help put the results in context. So that update is coming very soon. As the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative continues to conduct hundreds of trials each year, we can add additional management filters to the Data Explorer so you can go even more granular in finding trials that are just like your farm. So then we have the simulation tool, and this tool allows you to enter information about your farm. So location, the crop rotation, weather, residual soil nitrate, like we've been talking about, planting date, and then what you've marketed your grain at and your price that you paid for nitrogen. And it comes up with a range of rational nitrogen rates and expected yield for that farm. You can compare different management decisions. Once you've made that calculation, you can see how that would impact it. You can save scenarios and compare for later. And it's just a way for us to show how those different management decisions or environmental factors changes the optimum nitrogen rate.
Tom, I would just add, of all those factors that Melissa just described that you can input into the NFAC decision tool to identify your range of nitrogen fertilizer rates, residual soil nitrogen is one of the biggest factors. And I'd encourage all your listeners to go into the NFAC tool and look at what a large effect residual soil nitrogen can have on your optimum rate. And it may make you decide to go out and make a soil test.
So 3 years into these trials, and you work with some very good farmers who have enrolled in these things, are you seeing any feedback from either your trial participants or other farmers who have used the NFAC tool and some changes that they've made on their farms in determining nitrogen rates?
Yes, absolutely. So from a trial perspective, we consistently receive feedback from participants that this is the most valuable trial they've participated in on their farm, especially people they have long histories of, doing different trials on their farm. This one is the easiest, and it's also giving them very important information moving forward. We have heard from some of our participants that they feel more comfortable in applying a lower rate based on what they know and what's moving forward.
So, Melissa, what are some significant changes farmers are making when they start plugging their own fields and management practices into NFAC?
Well, one of the most practical ways to use this tool is as a basis for discussion with your agronomist when you're making application decisions. You're not going to get one specific number recommendation when you run the simulation tool. It's not going to spit out a variable rate application prescription, but you can check the results against your current practices and compare the impact of these different management choices, the different environmental environmental factors and make a more informed decision for each field. So really trying to reduce the risk when we're making that decision. Another use that we've seen, farmers run the tool before the growing season and they get that recommended range, and then they'll come back and rerun it once we have an actual number for spring precipitation, and then they can use that information to help them decide on additional and applications for the season.
We are seeing farmers make more split in-season applications, and so this tool can really help fine-tune that so you're not under-applying. You're still maximizing your yield, but based on the weather and the environmental conditions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When we're out talking with people, it's very common to have questions about what does this mean for split applied? Do you factor that into your trials? Are those trials represented in the data? And the answer is yes.
No, but I think Melissa made a really good point that we probably don't say enough, is that just so farmers know among their peers, most farmers are split applying their nitrogen.
Well, and you also mentioned some differences by region. Is that based on soil type, topography, weather? What are some of those factors that go into differences in regionalization that you've noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a combination of the mineralization. There may have been something impacting the crop that wasn't related to nitrogen. So we might have seen a lot more disease in a particular area than we did in others. There's variability in precipitation, in soil types, drainage systems, and all of that impacts mineralization and residual soil nitrogen.
So a big combination of complex factors.
Absolutely. This is all very complex, yes.
So as we move forward, what unanswered questions are there about things like cover crops, tillage, or underrepresented regions that you're going to continue to fine-tune and study in the next phase of the research?
As we move forward with the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative, we're always looking to better understand how various management factors, particularly the ones that are the most important to Iowa farmers, affect optimum fertilizer management in the state and rational nitrogen rates for corn production. Some of those factors that we're really considering as high priorities in the future include cover crop management, tillage management, and drainage management.
And if there's one takeaway that you want Iowa farmers to remember heading into the 2026 growing season, what is it?
Residual soil nitrogen levels have a big impact on your fertilizer needs. And these are things we can measure and manage for. And I'd encourage listeners to go to our NFAC tool, look at the simulation tool, and play with how much residual nitrogen affects the rational range of fertilizer rates for your operation. In some counties, it's as much as 40 pounds per acre difference. Nobody wants to over-apply nitrogen, and we're trying to provide some tools to help to make sure that it doesn't happen. Every year is different.
As conditions in the environment change, farmers always adapt. With that in mind, I'll echo Melissa and Dr. Castellano. Continue to assess your own soil conditions and be sure to check out the NFAC tool to help you land on your optimum nitrogen fertilizer rates this spring. We've included a link to NFAC down in the notes for this podcast episode. I also wanted to let you know that later this month, Iowa Farm Bureau will be hosting a webinar in partnership with Iowa State University that dives deeper into understanding the residual nitrogen levels in your soil using the NFAC tool and more. So watch for more information on that webinar in the coming days. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some helpful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on March 16th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.